Raveling Old Threads. When Jennifer Gibson first invited me to come here today and discuss my art practice, I was pleased and excited. After all, how hard could it be to talk about myself and everything I have done in the last 5 years or so? As I thought about it further, I quickly became vexed by a persistent thunking sound. Somehow, somewhere, the proverbial shoe was dropping. My art practice had evolved in and because of a transformative time in my life. What I have been doing with my hands echoes in my head and in my heart. So although a lecture usually requires its speaker to, quote, hand you a nugget of pure truth to wrap up and keep on the mantelpiece forever, I regret that I cannot offer you such an ornament. There is no single story, no one concept or aesthetic theory that inspires me. Under the circumstances, the best I can offer is an observation. Each of the embroideries in the exhibition is but an illusion of cohesion. As you examine them carefully, you will see that they are symphonies of fragmentation, composed literally of tens of thousands of stitches, each one a mark, a movement, a word. But what is the grammar of thread? How do these individual marks coalesce into images that speak, perhaps even breathe? The answer to these questions lies in an even more fundamental one. How do you pick up the threads of an old life? Is the way forward perhaps also the way back, the future swirling through the past? As Margaret Lawrence tells us, the rivers of our imaginations and our lives flow both ways. Let's drift on this current a while and see where we wash up. Everything always begins with a knot. A line of embroidery is the opposite of a sentence. It begins with a period in the shape of a knot and glides forward slowly, building momentum as it punctures the resistance of the fabric, laying one fiber against another, light glinting off of disparate layers of color and truth. As far as I can tell, my art practice began on a frigid day in February 2005, a day full of snags and knots of a different kind. My life had become very tangled because I had recently dropped out of law school for the second time in my life, and for the first time, I was at a complete standstill. I had no job, no place in an academic program, and seemingly no prospects. I could not escape the feeling that I had been given so many gifts and that somehow I had squandered them. In the midst of all of those knots, all I could feel was a profound emptiness, a stillness that was only matched by the frigid air of that winter afternoon. In an attempt to connect, to be somewhere, even for a moment, I went walking in the mall, imagining, as I often did, all of the lives that intersected with the goods on display. After a while, I came across a handbag embellished with silk flowers. It was a promise of spring, of hope, and it was way outside my price range. As my spirits drooped, I remember thinking, maybe you could do that. Maybe you could do better. From that moment until 2012, I proceeded to do just that. Handing on history eventually grew into my first major body of work. It sprang out of my love of literature as a reader, a writer, and a teacher. It began in earnest a year later in 2006 when I was working here at University of Winnipeg as a stipendiary instructor and drew on my experiences of teaching women's literature. Through teaching this class, I was continually reminded of the importance of valuing women's lived experiences as art. The work of many of the writers we studied gave voice to the vitality of the cultural exchanges between women and reminded me of what we have to offer one another. What I found perplexing, however, was that while many of my students were familiar with the work of the writers we studied, they did not always perceive the relevance of that work or those lives to their own. As a form of response to this disconnect, I began constructing handbags based on the lives and work of women writers. This was my first attempt at merging linguistic concepts with visual ones. I strove to transform the metaphorical associations of the bag itself and the text it was about into something you could see outside your mind's eye, into something you could hold in your hand. The bags themselves seemed to be the ideal canvas for this work. In contemporary Western cultures, they act as portable sites of quiet resistance. Although marketing strategies have recently equated handbags with sexualization, wealth, and power, functionally they still operate as an oasis of private architectural space in an otherwise public environment. The handbag is literally the repository of our identities, our credentials, and our secrets. In short, they are a microcosmic metaphor of the self. As the series evolved, these issues expanded to include questions concerning the resonance between women's art history, their lives, and perceptions of the cultural value of their art. The first bag I'd like to discuss is Gertrude Stein. One woman who addresses all of these issues with a style all her own is Gertrude Stein. She was an undeniable physical presence whose personal life has become fruitfully intertwined with her creative work. Gertrude was born on February 3, 1874, to Daniel and Amelia Stein in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Her family was large, affluent, and well-educated. After attending Radcliffe College and Johns Hopkins Medical School, she relocated to Paris in 1903, where she and her brother Leo quickly gained reputations as astute collectors of modern art. She met her partner, Alice B. Toklas, on September 8, 1907, and they were not separated, not even for a day, until Gertrude's death. They became famous for their enthusiastic participation in art and life, and their homes on 27 Rue de Fleur and 5 Rue Christine became hubs of Parisian artistic and intellectual activity. They remained in France through both World Wars, escaped persecution by the Nazis, and returned to Paris in December 1944. Gertrude has 31 published works to her credit, 26 during her lifetime. She was famous, both in Europe and America, for reinventing the ways we think about language and literary form. She died of stomach cancer on July 27, 1946. In tribute to Gertrude's harmonization of life and art, this handbag is a creative merger of her physical characteristics and her aesthetic. Its shape is a reflection of Gertrude's body, and the velvet background was inspired by her penchant for velvet trim on the tweed suits that she habitually wore. The overall concept of the exterior as a representation of a pigeon is an homage to the famous Pigeons on the Grass wallpaper that graced the sitting room at 5 Rue Christine, where so many of her famous salons were hosted. Since I could not find a fabric that was a close replication of the wallpaper, I decided to make the entire bag into a pigeon. This explains the presence of the wings on either side and of the blue eye on the frame of the bag. This slide also illustrates the wire wrapping technique I used to construct the handle. Heavy gauge copper wire is intertwined with fine jewelry wire and encrusted with semi-precious stones, again envisioning the way that Gertrude's sense of selfhood was integrally connected to her art and her sense of beauty. Stein's understanding of the beauty of language revolutionized modern literature. While many may find her work complex, there are 3 principles that might help us to understand her perspective. Stein strove to think of language not as a transparency or absence, but as an artistic media with its own distinct qualities and characteristics. This is why she famously declared that nothing has ever been more exciting than diagramming sentences. Her writing challenges traditional linear grammatical structures that are based on a system of valuation and relativity. She replaced this system where the page is a flat land, where there is neither foreground nor background, where each word has a meaning unto itself and exists independently of its context. The concept of the continuous present became the hallmark of Stein's writing and is tied to her use of the Cubist practice of fragmentation. The concept of fragmentation requires the artist to compose not a coherent single image, but a pattern of images constructed of visual or linguistic fragments that blend together like silt. This ensures that there is no one meaning that is prioritized or valued above the others. For Stein, the important thing is that you must have deep down, as the deepest thing in you, a sense of equality. Her most famous evocation of this idea is her poem, "A Rose is a Rose is a Rose," which revitalizes the image of the rose in poetry. Because of the common use of the rose as a metaphor for love, it has become a dead metaphor. The rose is incapable of being seen for itself because it has been subordinated to the concept of love for so long. In simply declaring that a rose is nothing more than itself, Stein severed this connection and asserted that in that line, the rose is read for the first time in English poetry for 100 years. In other words, we are finally able to see it for itself and not for what it represents. True to her belief that life and art are one, Stein's custom-tailored clothing also reflected her thought that meaning and identity are generated through the progressive layering of disparate elements. For this reason, the recognizable style of Gertrude Stein was not limited to the exterior of her garments, but also took into account the interiors. With linings and vests designed with custom fabric woven by Pierre Balmain, Stein created an aesthetic that was at once exotic and naturalized, and unmistakably Gertrude. It is this practice that inspired my choice of oriental silk for the lining of the handbag. Baby Precious Always Shines is the way that Gertrude invariably addressed Alice in their love notes and private correspondence. There are 312 of these notes surviving in the Yale Collection of American Literature, the majority dating from 1935 to 46. The notes, each one a fragment of their daily lives, fit together to provide a portrait of their relationship. Since Alice was such an integral part of Gertrude's inner life, it seemed only fitting that a tribute to their love should grace the interior of the bag. The Stone Diaries. The inspiration for this handbag is the limestone tower built by Kyler Goodwill in memory of his wife Mercy in Carol Shield's novel, The Stone Diaries. The Goodwill Tower is arguably the central metaphor of the novel. It enlivens, celebrates, and memorializes the process of artistic creation. Kyler's decision to build the tower begins out of a sense of profound loss, one that has shaken the very foundations of his life. His immediate response to this tidal wash of grief is to try and immortalize what has been lost and so reclaim it. However, what is interesting about the search for lost things is that you often find what you didn't expect. In setting an aesthetic and technical challenge to build the tower without mortar, Kyler opens himself to the possibility of greatness, and he finds it. One morning when he sees a rainbow arcing over the tower, he is transported from the level of artisan to the realm of the artist. His experience of ecstasy, of literally standing outside himself, fueled the transformation of his structure from a dream of sorrow mingled with bewilderment into a joyful living testament to his love and his gift. In order to capture the organic writhing quality of the tower, I constructed this handbag by twisting fencing wire and wrapping it with silver jewelry wire. The tall, arcing handle is emblematic of Kyler's rainbow. The wires crossing the plane of the bag represent the gaps between the limestone rocks he has mounted. In the novel, Shields provides us with an extensive list of objects that Kyler chiseled on the stones before he set them. And one of my challenges was to link as many of these objects as possible into one narrative design. The first side of the tower illustrates the emotional motivation behind Kyler's project. Since each one of his first stones is a little one, down near the bottom inscribed with the single word, "Woe," it seemed fitting that for the first part of the bag's narrative, it should be inspired by grief and loss. Since his visual resources were limited to nature, the Canadian Farmer's Almanac, the Eaton's Catalog, and the Illustrated Bible, I tailored the scope of my research to images that were historically appropriate or that would have been available and familiar to him in 1905. As a result, the source for my mermaid was J.W. Waterhouse's painting for the Royal Academy of Art in 1901. Contrary to Waterhouse's portrait where the mermaid is looking towards someone, mine is looking away. She is not the visual center of my portrait, but exists on the margins and is portrayed in a closed, defensive pose. The northern pike is a common fish that is native to Manitoba and would have been a very familiar sight to anyone living in the Interlake. The fish is moving away from the center of the portrait and the mermaid, signifying the complete rupture of the visual relationship between them. The full moon, traditionally emblematic of grief, shines a watery, insubstantial light over the scene as the mermaid cries out, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" These emotions are emphasized by the muted and muddied colors in which the design is executed, themselves inspired by the subtlety of Cuyler's etchings. The opposite side of the bag is designed to represent Cuyler's moment of ecstasy and the rapturous communion with his muse. To that end, the portrait is sewn using bright organic colors evocative of a warm prairie spring. The inspiration for the female robin was a standard image in the North American Field Guide, and the bird's familiar song most closely parallels Cuyler's own noisy release. The scriptural element of this narrative expresses the joy and quiet exaltation that comes after sorrow subsides and love reemerges from the shadows of grief. On the interior of the bag, at the symbolic center of the tower, lies the key question of Daisy Goodwill's life and of the novel as a whole. What is the story of a life? Hold Your Tongue was inspired by Ovid's myth of the origins of the nightingale, as told in the story of Tereus, Procne, and Philomena in Book 6 of the Metamorphoses. Arguably one of the most violent sections in the entire epic, this section of the poem explores how abuse and silence can metamorphosize into song and beauty through art. The tale begins by detailing the love and fidelity of two sisters, Procne and Philomena. When Procne is wed to Tereus, a prince of a neighboring kingdom, she has to leave her homeland and her sister behind. 5 years pass until Procne asks Tereus for a great gift. She asks him to escort Philomena on a trip to visit her. Tereus agrees and journeys to get Philomena. On the way back, however, he is filled with lust and brutally assaults her. Philomena is overcome with rage and despair, and she vows to shout his crime so loudly that, quote, her words will ring through the trees, the very rocks will know and be moved to pity by what I have suffered. These threats fill Tereus with a lethal combination of anger and fear, and he does the one thing he can think of to prevent his own exposure and ruin. He cuts out Philomena's tongue and leaves her to die. He returns home to Procne, empty-handed, and informs her of Philomena's accidental death in the forest, and she plunges into mourning. Back in the forest, Philomena makes a surprising decision. She chooses to live. She bends all her energy and resources into weaving a tapestry as a message to her sister. When the tapestry is finally complete, she convinces a traveler to carry it to Procne, who promptly reads it, rescues her sister, and exacts a terrible revenge on her husband. As an enraged Tereus pursues both sisters, swearing their deaths, they transform into nightingales and fly away. Although the details of this story are difficult, I was drawn to it because it intersects with several issues of long-standing interest to me. Portrayal of women's bodies in art and literature, the silencing of women in patriarchal culture, and the potential of art to be subversive, to speak and be heard in situations where other voices fall silent. To portray the relationship between the two sisters, I embroidered a double portrait by using the reverse side of the original embroidery, which is the side that is normally hidden and unseen, as the front of the handbag. The bag itself is fashioned from suede, from skin, in the shape of a tongue, and it opens upon one of the most provocative questions ever asked in literature. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? All that glitters. Although Hold Your Tongue is important to me conceptually and aesthetically, it is also important to me personally because it was the final piece of work I completed as part of the MAUA Foundation Mentorship Program. This program pairs an emerging woman artist with an established one for an entire year. The year I participated, 2011-2012, was an incredibly fruitful one for me. The nature of my work is solitary, But however, during my mentorship year, I was introduced to a broad range of vibrant and inspiring artists, and I began to feel like I was part of a community. In recognition of that sense of community, my FMP group all decided that we wanted to participate in Nuit Blanche together. Our show, The Midnight Petting Zoo, challenged the conventional notion that art on display is remote and literally untouchable. Accordingly, the goal of the show was to create work that engaged the audience, not just visually, but through tactility. Since my art practice focused on small, intricately rendered, delicate, and definitely untouchable compositions, I quietly decided that my work did not fit and that I would not participate. My mentor, Diana Thornycroft, noticed my reticence in the planning meetings and questioned me on it. When I said that I had no ideas for the show and pointed out that the time frame of 7 weeks was surely not enough to embroider anything, she just looked at me in a very singular fashion and said, "Think about it." And so I did think about it, frequently, constantly, despairingly, until 2 weeks later when the most perplexing phrase suddenly popped into my head. Glitter skunk. What the heck is a glitter skunk, I asked myself, and promptly spent the next 5 weeks sewing like a crazy person to find out. The result was Trapped, the first of my embroidered animal sculptures. With a wink of an eye and a flick of her tail, Skunky swept me away from a familiar shore into a current of thought and engagement that has buoyed me along for the last 2 years. Since she was substantially larger than any work I had completed before, and I had a fraction of the time I usually needed to complete an embroidery, the composition of Trapped necessarily revolutionized all my existing practices, procedures, and techniques. Most importantly, this work was not a handbag, not a manufactured object. She was a body, a skin. She had been alive. In those first weeks, the fundamental fact of Skunky's body was a challenge and a struggle. To be honest, I didn't have the slightest clue about what I was doing, conceptually or technically. Initially, the way I approached my discomfiture was through humor. Jokingly, I asked myself, what was the last thing she saw before she died? And let all of the obvious sardonic responses roll. Pretty quickly, though, I wasn't laughing anymore. I suddenly realized that in acknowledging the moment of her death, I was being given the opportunity to actually see her, hold her, and read her for the very first time. And that was a moment of humility and grace I am not likely to forget. Since skunk pelts do not typically have a high market value, decisions about the care and preservation of the pelt typically reflect that value. Her skin was fairly brittle. Her nose was badly split. She had many puncture wounds and missing patches of fur. She was missing all 4 legs. As my eyes cataloged all of this, reading the story of her death, I suddenly really wanted to tell the story of her life. Although skunks are typically shy, retiring animals, I wanted this one's life to be fun, decadent, and beautiful. Above all, I wanted her story to be a means of returning her home. But how to accomplish all of this? I started by doing what I know. I researched the behaviors and natural habitats of skunks, as well as traditional stories about their origins and spiritual qualities. And then, because time was running thin, I did something different. I stopped thinking and started sewing. Or rather, I let my hands do the thinking for the first time in my life. This decision produced a rather remarkable and unexpected effect. Even though I was working 16 to 18 hours a day to meet my deadline, my work became a form of meditation. Although I was not able to identify it until much later, Trapped altered the mechanism of my creative process from preparedness to readiness. In retrospect, Skunky's body operated like a preposition in a sentence. It located me in space and time. Although I began my work with her from a position of familiarity and prepared myself to make work about her, my acknowledgement of her as a living entity led me quickly to the realization that the embroidery was no longer about her. It was a conversation with her. In other words, I could prepare all I wanted, but nothing would happen until I was also ready. I was quiet, I was listening. With all of these changes and challenges, no one was more surprised than me than when the final result emerged. In that moment, I felt nothing else mattered. As Virginia Woolf said, there it was, my picture. Yes, with all of its greens and blues, its lines running up and across, its attempt at something. It would be hung in the attics, I thought. It would be destroyed. But what did it matter? I asked myself, taking up my needle again. With a sudden intensity, as if I saw it clear for a second, I stitched a line there in the center. It was done. It was finished. Yes, I thought, laying down the needle in extreme fatigue, I have had my vision. One good story. As time has passed, I have had many questions and many opportunities to think about what has transpired and where I am headed. From all of that rumination, two major points have become clear. There are other voices waiting, other conversations whispering in my ear. Whether they are of a singing bone, a laughing river, sunlight tickling reeds on the edge of a swamp. Summer wind racing across a prairie field. A night sky swirling before the dawn. Or a shadow winging away like smoke rising from the trees. Although I feel like this listening, this creative process has been a profoundly personal experience, I recognize that this body of work is also deeply conceptual. What has changed is the way that I understand and define conceptuality. Beyond the obvious tie between the animals and images of the Canadian landscape, it is this duality between subject and object that links the Trap series most closely to the Group of Seven. The Group of Seven was formed in the early years of the 20th century in an attempt to, quote, shake off the gloom of a colonial attitude by creating images that would bring Canadians to an awareness of their own land through a made-in-Canada aesthetic. As part of their practice, each member of the group spent large portions of the year exploring and living in the landscapes that they painted. A process that Lauren Harris referred to as, quote, finding our emotional bearings, both as individuals and representatives of a nation. Thus, it comes as no surprise that the images created during those years are conceptual and visceral, cerebral and emotional, objective and subjective, records of a time and place. The group's unquenchable desire to say something about Canada, about national identity, propelled them forward into a series of adventures. These experiences created very profound and personal bonds, not only with each other, but with the landscape that was both the subject and object of their paintings, the voice of their passionate aesthetics. Simply put, each of the Group of Seven images was composed as a ballad, a love song to a particular place and moment in time. Just as many of the most familiar group of 7 images are field studies painted on small surfaces in the awe and immediacy of the moment, At the 100th Meridian began as a fabric doodle in response to my first trip to Riding Mountain National Park. In August 2012, my partner Barb and I took a quick trip to Wasagamine for the opening of Slow Craft, a Manitoba Craft Council juried exhibition in which I was participating. I was excited because I had not been on a road trip for a while, and I was looking forward to seeing something new, something different. Although the weather was cool and the skies moody, I could not take my eyes off the car windows. The colors and contours of the landscape were unlike any I had seen around Winnipeg. The landscape was lush, lithe, and rhythmic. When I returned home, I was desperate to think of a way to record all that I had seen before it faded. Drawings didn't seem to capture it, so I decided to try something different. I made a fabric doodle. Over the next 5 days, I embroidered my memories of what I had seen and felt, with no plans, no drawings, and only one rule. Start at the top left corner and get to the bottom right. The result was something I called my strange little landscape. Thanks to a grant from the Manitoba Arts Council, the project expanded into plans for a series of large-scale tapestries depicting my experiences in different locations and seasons in Manitoba. Through the Deep Bay Residency Program, I was able to go back to Wasagamine in the summer of 2013 and begin work on the first of the series at the 100th Meridian. On a technical level, this work is about stretching the conventional limitations of a particular kind of embroidery stitch called satin stitch. I wanted to employ this particular stitch because it has a lush and rhythmic quality, just like what I remembered seeing that day the summer before. Typically, these kinds of stitches are kept fairly short because it becomes difficult to maintain tension and density as they grow longer. This challenge prepared me for a number of the technical issues I would later encounter with the animals, and conceptually provided a place for us all to settle and call home. For that reason, At the 100th Meridian is my ballad, my love song to a particular moment in time. The creation of the Trap series followed a similar melody, but what has emerged is not a ballad, but an elegy. For each of the animals, the landscape is not immediate, not present. It is the trace of a note echoing through a vast silence. In all that has been lost, what has reverberated, what has come back to us? Through my choice of medium, the animals have become archival objects. The methodology used to create them evokes memories of traditional embroidery techniques, as well as memories of the Manitoba fur trade. They raise familiar but pressing questions about the way we understand bodies, bodies of land, bodies of art, animals' bodies, and women's bodies. The metaphor of the trap gapes at the center, baiting us with questions about beauty and the gaze. Each of these issues is another part of the pattern, another twist of thread which catches our eyes and engages our minds. What I have offered in the time available today is but a fragment of the story, a piece of a journey that has just begun. Thank you.